Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming. This is really exciting for me. Thanks so much, Liberty on the Rocks, for having me. If you don't know who I am, I'm the author of a new book called Bitcoin and Beef. And just a little introduction. I'm not a Bitcoin expert. I don't work in the space. I'm not a regenerative agriculture rancher such as Jason Rick in the audience, but I'm extremely passionate about these two topics, about decentralization and about connecting the parallels and the importance of self-responsibility, sovereignty, and self-custody in the financial, monetary systems as well as our food systems. So how did I come to this point in my life? Just a quick introduction. Some of you might think that, I'm pretty young to be talking about this stuff. At least that's what my coworkers tell me when I give them harsh feedback, and they've been in the industry for 30 years in semiconductors. But I've been obsessed with health since sustaining one too many concussions in college about 4 years ago. Kind of went down the self-healing rabbit hole. Classic traditional medical system did not help me out at all. Kind of told me to take it easy. And I think a lot of people may be struggling with similar health issues, and I connected with them, connected with this entire community of free health information, and I really, became obsessed when I started to make progress in my own journey of self-healing and health optimization. So since then, I've been hooked, and naturally, I got into the food system and learning about how corrupt and centralized our food and agriculture systems are, and how I really wanted to make a difference in this space. And simultaneously, I was also really into crypto, being an engineer in college, and that later turned into, just mostly Bitcoin, of course. And I realized I was teeter-tottering between two passions of mine, and then also, had to show up to my day job as an engineer as well, and struggling, how could I make a difference in these communities and, set foot in being a part of, making a difference. So it clicked to me one day, connecting more. I had a health Instagram for the last 3 years, kind of just posting, my lifestyle habits and connecting with more and more people. And one day for me, it clicked. Why was I so into Bitcoin, and why was I so into, optimizing my health and taking control of what I eat? And it really came down to that, is I wanted to be in the driver's seat of my life. I had my health robbed from me for over a year when I was concussed. I had daily headaches. I couldn't exercise. Went from being a college athlete to not even being able to walk across my own college campus without being extremely fatigued. So I was robbed of just a basic liberty of doing the things that I wanted to do. So from there on out, I was convinced that I always wanted to be in the driver's seat of my own life. And that's what these topics are about. And that's what my book is about. Connecting these two items and tying them together, because a lot of the items that happened in history in our food system is a result of the decisions made by our monetary system and who is making the decisions there. But in reality, why are you all here? Because you value the liberty of making your own decisions in your life and having the most amount of control for having positive outcomes. You don't care as much about convenience. You care more about conviction and control. So Bitcoin and beef, really, I just wanted to make a difference and tie these two topics together. So why don't we start with our health of our society right now? So this has kind of been put on the forefront, of course, the last 3 years with the lovely epidemic that we've had, and that has changed everybody's life, including mine, and it allowed me to write this book while working from home and still making a nice salary as an engineer. But seriously, if you look at just indicators such as lifespan, or maybe before COVID, you kind of just had a naive viewpoint. You might have thought that we're doing pretty well from a societal health perspective, worldwide, nationwide, but this is absolutely not the case. And what I write about in the beginning of my book is that lifespan is one of the most flawed ways to measure societal health because of so much skewed data towards infant mortality as well as death from childbirth. So you can see from the 1980s, and if you extrapolated this graph to the early 20th century and even beyond, the average lifespan was in the 60s, it was in the 50s, it was in the 40s. But in reality, that was just because the average family of 4, you might have a mother die at childbirth at 30 and one child die at age 5, so that skews the whole lifespan statistic for the family. The longevity, people have been living to 80, 90, 100 years old for quite some time. So in reality, especially in the United States, and what this graph shows is that we're spending more on healthcare, and even with this flawed, skewed statistic, we are plateauing compared to other developed nations, and it's really a testament to a broken healthcare system, which should be called a sick care system, as maybe you have heard, and that is a result of our food system, and it can be tied back to our monetary system as well. So you can see on average the United States we're spending double the amount of healthcare, and we have a lower average lifespan than other developed nations. Going to the monetary system, fiat, we're fully committed, unfortunately, to the fiat dollar. So you probably have seen this in some way, shape, or form on social media. The purchasing power of the US dollar has fallen off a cliff since the Federal Reserve Act first came into effect in the early 20th century, and since we have fully broken ties with the gold standard, and since COVID, that has only accelerated with inflation. So just setting the scene here on what I talk about in my book and what I think are the 2 most important aspects of your life: your health and your wealth. So our health, what is going on? I point to these lifespan statistics. I point to this increased healthcare cost. Why are we spending so much money on healthcare? Well, that's because 60% of adults in the United States have at least one chronic disease, and 40% have 2 or more. And this is much higher than other developed nations as well, and is the reason why we're spending so much money on healthcare. Because a chronic disease is a disease that is treated and goes on for longer than a year or more at a time. And if you look to the right here, it's a comparison of the cause of death from 2010 to the turn of the century in 1900, where the highest causes of death were all infectious diseases: tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza. And as you can see, heart disease and cancer, although are appearing in the top 10 causes of death in 1900, but they're much less prevalent. And cancer has gone up 4-fold over the course of a century, and heart disease up 50%, and this is still climbing. And if you look at societal health as well from just a body mass index perspective, which is also not a perfect metric, but I don't think we need a metric to know that our society has become pretty overweight. 42% of Americans are obese compared to just 15% 32 years ago. So why is that? What's going on with our food? So just a little rabbit hole down. What are we eating that's different? This is not the only aspect of what is going on, what's causing cancer, heart disease. These are all environmental factors, stressors, how you sleep, but how you eat is also, of course, the biggest part of that, and that's probably the biggest one that we can tap into in terms of controlling in our food system. So as major sources of calorie across the 20th century, you can see, well, you might be able to see. There's a lot of lines on this chart. The biggest increase has been in soybean oil, which virtually had zero consumption in the early 20th century. And there are other vegetable oils and seed oils that aren't shown on this chart that have a tremendous growth as well in consumption, and also in chicken and vegetable shortening and in sugar. We consumed a lot of sugar, but now we're consuming even more sugar, vegetable shortening, and then chicken, which is quite astounding. And this all has to do with sort of the demonization of saturated fat and animal foods, which I'll get more into. But just from a epidemiological correlative perspective, we're eating far less butter, far less lard and animal fats, and replacing them with highly processed vegetable oils such as soybean oil. So how do we get here? It's actually a pretty crazy story that I'll try and summarize here with some dates and some facts. Dwight Eisenhower, a popular president, in 1955 was playing golf and suffered a massive heart attack, which shocked the nation because cardiovascular disease was a growing epidemic in the 50s. And it was on the rise. It was killing more and more people, and we really didn't know why. So, associations were formed, the American Heart Association, and when Eisenhower went down, it really put everyone on high alert, especially scientists and researchers, as to figure out why this was happening. So a famous researcher named Ansel Keys from the University of Minnesota was fascinated with this topic of what caused cardiovascular disease in the 1940s. And he kind of started his studies in the 1950s and kind of became the poster child of research for finding out why this was occurring, why cardiovascular disease was becoming so prevalent today or then in society. So he came up with this 7 countries study, and he started taking, well, it wasn't called that, but it ended up being called that because he started taking a look at other countries outside the US and their saturated fat consumption as well as their incidence of cardiovascular disease, because that was his hypothesis. And he kind of cherry-picked some data from 7 countries to show that a higher saturated fat intake correlated with higher cardiovascular disease. Don't know the exact countries off the top of my head, but you can look them up. And he didn't wrap up these studies until the 80s, but this kind of cemented the thought process for the dietary recommendations for decades. I mean, still today, they use this information or the foundation of thought from these studies to say that animal fats and saturated fats are the cause of heart disease via the mechanism of increasing your cholesterol, specifically low-density lipoprotein, LDL cholesterol. So in 1961, the American Heart Association came out with its first statement on advising against the consumption of saturated fat and recommended that you replace them with polyunsaturated fatty acids such as vegetable oils. So cook with vegetable oils instead of animal fats was basically the recommendation. So this kind of led to this large increase in consumption of vegetable oils, and there was a lot of factors going on as well at the same time period in the 60s and the 70s. Cottonseed oil was actually the main seed oil for a long time, but then that kind of tapered off with the rise of polyester clothing. Cottonseed oil was a byproduct of cotton production for clothing, and that kind of tapered off with the rise of polyester clothing being mostly made from petrochemical products as well, and that had a play in the rise of soybean oil. Consumption across the next decade from 67 to 77 quadrupled from 2 to 8 kilograms per person per year, or roughly 17, 18 pounds per person per year. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, in 2021, the average consumption is 34 kilograms per person per year. Or, what is that math? 70 pounds? Insane. So how did that happen? Well, the U.S. dietary guidelines just kept feeding this information to the public, and there was an explosion of U.S. government subsidies in agriculture that started in the 80s, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that happened as a result of USDA Secretary of Ag that's very famous. And yeah, you can see $45 billion in soybean subsidies from 1995 to 2020. Ironically enough, a lot of those soybeans are really also still used for animal feed, mostly chicken and pork, not beef, which is important to note because vegans like to say that it's for beef. But 1990, McDonald's switched its fryers from beef tallow to vegetable oil, which kind of surprised me because a lot of the high fructose corn syrup switch in the soft drink industry happened far before this. There was a lot of campaigning going on against fast foods to switch to unsaturated fatty acids in their ingredients. There was a man named Phil Sokolov who had a heart attack in 1966 and made it his life mission to campaign against fast food companies. And ironically enough, McDonald's finally caved, and then their stock dropped immediately because the taste of fries was not as familiar and enjoyable. So that's just an example of our food system, why we have such a rise in seed oil consumption and soybean oil specifically. And now we use 88 million acres in the United States to farm soybeans. which is the second highest amount for any crop, just short of corn, which we use 93 million acres to farm corn. So what's the result of that? This. 10 companies that control pretty much all of the country and world's processed food that lines the grocery stores with bright colors, fancy packaging, fancy marketing departments, 25 plus ingredients that you can't pronounce. And this is where all these oils and unhealthy sugars, processed ingredients, preservatives are all hidden. So this is the result of the centralization of food, as well as poor government policy and poor health is the end result for the consumer, which is unfortunate because if you aren't paying attention or you weren't paying attention and you're simply listening to your government on the recommendations, you would be suffering in the result of your health because this is flawed research and it's corporate greed working hand in hand. So this is not just going on in the processed food industry. The meat industry is one of the most centralized industries in the world, especially beef, where 80+% of the meat packers, the industry is controlled. 4 companies control 80% of the meat packing industry. Pork and poultry also very high, but pretty much JBS, Cargill, Tyson, these guys are making all the decisions. They're lobbying extremely hard for legislation, and they're creating a multinational global supply chain which is destroying the local economy, and it's destroying the ability for the small farmer to make a profit and stay afloat. And as you can see, the number of farms and the size of farms has changed drastically over the 20th century. The advancement in technology, as well as the demand for monocrop agriculture via the subsidization of crops and industrial farming system that was pushed by the government, we have had an extreme consolidation of our farms, and from going from 7 million farms in the early 20th century to now just over 2 million, as well as the average commodity grown to just above 1. But another statistic that I like to point out with the meat industry is we've pretty much become a global food supply chain, and that has complicated things drastically. If you've noticed in the past year, grocery stores have been often empty on the shelves because actually 75 to 80% of your grass-fed beef is being imported from other countries. Australia, Uruguay, New Zealand, Argentina, that is where your beef is coming from if you buy it from your average grocery store, and your American beef is being sold to China, Korea, Taiwan for a much higher price by the thousands as a result of a highly centralized food system. So 1971 is a pretty important year. Many of you probably know what happened in that year as a result of our monetary system. The final straw, Nixon cut the tie. But it might even be a more important year for our food system, because that's the year that Nixon appointed Earl Butz as the secretary of the USDA, who had this grandiose vision to feed the world. And he was an agribusiness guy. He was a part of the Purdue Agricultural Department. He was a board member for several agricultural business firms, including Ralston Purina. And really his motto was to squeeze everything out of the land and become the world's largest exporter of commodity crops. So you just heard Jason say it. After engineering a massive grain sale to the Soviets in 1970, which took off our exports as a country and put the world on notice. This was during the Cold War, so this is like a huge deal. We just sold like all our grain to the Soviets. I don't know why we would do that, but we like money. So Butz's big motto, like Jason just said, was get big or get out. And he saw this opportunity with grain prices being so high that the U.S. could basically make a killing. So he told all the farmers in the Midwest, take as much debt on as possible, get big, and use the industrial farming system to grow as much corn and as much soy as possible. He wanted to see rows and rows of monocrop agriculture, which forced farmers to take on massive debt to buy machinery, to buy more land, to use as much chemical inputs as possible to get the highest yields possible. Now, this was fantastic because the price of grain was so high. And as you can see on the chart, the U.S. exports in the 70s, I mean, quadrupled, 5x, I don't know. Absolutely astronomical increase. We really hadn't exported too many agricultural products at that point, but the Soviet grain sale kicked us off, and Butts, that was the platform, that was the stand he was going to die on. And it sounded great at first until you realize what happened in the 70s because of the other nice, massive event in 1971. We went off the gold standard. Stagflation occurred, 20+% interest rates the Fed had to raise to combat inflation. Well, too bad they can't do that today, but we're getting there. 4% and growing. But grain prices eventually tanked as expected. That can't be sustained forever. And then these farmers had all this debt with massive interest rates at this point. So what happened as a result? Tens of thousands of farmers went under. They went bankrupt. And that furthered the consolidation and centralization of our food system, of our ag system. And as a result, subsidies became very popular because the government had to step in and save some of these farmers. So this is where crop insurance, all these types of programs that kind of guaranteed income for farmers really started, was because of these events from the 70s into the 80s as a result of the great Earl Butts, Secretary of the USDA. And as I mentioned before, the average farm in the U.S. now grows over just over one commodity. So at the turn of the century, the average farm grew 5 commodities. Now it's like 1.1. What does that mean? 99% of them are growing one crop. That's it. So why is industrial agriculture so bad? You know, high input, high output. We got high yields. Earl Butts, you know, you made us a lot of money. Why is it so bad? Well, it destroys our soil health. And this is the most important concept to grasp of anything probably that I say tonight, is that the health of the soil is the most important thing for our food system, for our food security, for societal health. And it's something we really need to change. The industrial farming system promotes high inputs. It promotes heavy tillage. So chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and single monocrop row agriculture. This destroys the health of the soil because you're disrupting the ecosystems below the ground. Think of all these chemical inputs as a broad spectrum antibiotic, right? This is also really bad for you. You probably, you know, if your health, you want to kill off one bacteria because you have an infection, you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, you're going to kill everything. It's the same thing for all of these chemical inputs. You're destroying all the life below the soil, below the ground, in the soil. And eventually, what does this result in? Stagnated yields, which we're already seeing. These charts only go out to 2010. But eventually, when the soil health becomes so poor, and this does take some time, and remember that we have some of the most fertile soil in the world in the Midwest, in the plains of the United States. Why is that? Anybody know? Because there was 40 to 50 million or maybe even more bison that were roaming the Great Plains in a manner that was sustainable. They would graze down to the lowest point, and then they wouldn't return for 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 years, depending on the area and their migratory patterns. So we had some of the richest topsoil in the world, and then we just monocropped the shit out of it. And now we have stagnated yields, and we have a food system and farming system that is so fragile that if an entire corn farmer's crop gets destroyed by a hailstorm, they don't even care because they still get a government check for their money. So they have no incentivization to switch to a better model. So they have lower resilience, they're more susceptible to pests, so they have to spray more chemicals because it's just one crop. You attract one pest that enjoys that one crop, and they will eat all of it. And there's lower nutrients in our food. So we're paying more for less nutrients. And as a result, we get chemical fertilizers that are also posing an extreme risk to our health directly. So here is just a chart that shows the growth of the use of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup you may have heard about. It's been directly linked to causing cancer. And you can see, this is 10 years ago, 2012, and it has only grown in use. It's been banned in many other countries, but the Midwest is pretty much all glyphosate. And it doesn't matter if you say stop using glyphosate on your farm, that's great, but it's still going to be in the ecosystem around you if you're surrounded by monocrop agriculture. So we want to talk about cancer rates quadrupling since the turn of the century, and glyphosate is not the only chemical input. Atrazine, there's tens of other ones, but this happens to be America's favorite. So this is now on our food. We had to genetically modify our crops in order to withstand the harsh chemical inputs from glyphosate, in order to kill literally everything else, all the pests, all the other life in our crops, just so we could grow corn, soy, wheat, canola, and other monocrops. So that's where we're at today. 1971, let's go back there. That was why we got Secretary Butts. That is why we got this insatiable desire. So this is what I pretty much tie everything back to. We went fully fiat in 1971. You never go fully fiat, if you know what that's referring to. So we went off the gold standard. The dollar has no inherent value. It's backed by nothing. What this causes, directly, of course, high inflation in the short term, high inflation on average over decades, and we're seeing that blow up in our faces right now. But the way I think about this is, in order to stay afloat, our economy just has to satisfy this insatiable desire of economic growth. We have to grow the economy double digits every year in order to keep up with our broken fiat monetary system. So that is why everything has turned into a greedy, centralized corporate business model where all they care about is making more money year over year, making more profits. So our food system, as a result, has just been big corporations buying up smaller guys, processing or turning their product into a highly processed item that makes them more money. That is why they don't like ranchers that are doing it the old-fashioned way. That is why JBS, Cargill, some of these big meat packers are some of the largest investors in plant-based foods. You think they give a shit about diet wars? They don't. They don't care about vegans. They don't care about carnivores. They care about making money. That's why they ship their beef to China. That is why they invest in lab-based meat, because it's higher profit and it satisfies this broken monetary system's requirement to grow, and that's just not sustainable. So as a result, we've had from the monetary system as well an extreme increase in the wealth gap. The income concentration has risen sharply since the 1970s. The compensation has not kept up with the cost of living. House prices, college tuition, everything under the sun. But I'm not going to talk a ton about our monetary system. I think everybody knows that it's broken. And nobody's getting 10, 20% raises from corporate. I know I'm not. Maybe I should work harder. But that's a problem. And it's finally, the dominoes have been falling across the 20th century. And now here in 2022, it's really blowing up in our faces. But I'm kind of excited. You know why? Because we have a solution, and you guys already know about decentralization and about Bitcoin. This is what it has to be, because a global supply chain for food, for anything, is not sustainable. It doesn't work. It's far too complex. A hyper-localized, decentralized approach is the only solution, and it is scalable, but it's not vertically scalable. It's replicatable, and that's what really matters. So our solution here is Bitcoin and regeneratively raised, wow, I should have taken Toastmasters class, beef. And it doesn't have to be beef. It has to be any ruminant. It is animals in a biodiverse ecosystem with plants. So Bitcoiners have a really cool saying, fix the money, fix the world. I'm a big fan of that. But I also think fix the soil, fix the earth fits here as well. And it's all tied together. So really my message, my prerogative is to connect as many people together on this message as possible, because this is what it's all about. So a lot of you probably already know about Bitcoin, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but why is Bitcoin fundamentally superior than any other form of money that has ever been created? Well, it has a fixed supply. 21 million Bitcoin will be the cap, and we're at just above 19 million right now. There's probably a few million lost, but I'm not going to get hung up on that. But it's programmed scarcity. It's native to the internet, so it's purely digital. It's extremely transferable, convenient. With the Lightning Network, you can send millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin for little to no fees. It's peer-to-peer, so you don't have to worry about dealing with our scuzzy banking system, which I write about in the book as well. I write about how many fines and violations all of these corporations have been paying. The banking system is the worst, $200 billion in fines and violation since the turn of the 20th century. So who are the real criminals? These centralized corporations are above the law, but if we speak out on Twitter, PayPal's going to freeze our money. I know I'm not using that service anymore, so that's what we've come to. Bitcoin provides the best option for unconfiscatable or unfuckwithable money, as some people like to say. And that comes with some caveats, of course. KYC, know your customer, is important. So you mentioned, Colin mentioned that earlier. So one of the best ways to get non-KYC Bitcoin is through mining, hosting through a company like his, or there are other ways, local Bitcoin transfers or coin joins, but that's something to get more educated on as well. Proof of work. The dollar is backed by nothing. Oh, it's backed by the US government, which is paid for with fiat. That's not going to last. Bitcoin, people say it's backed by math, backed by code. I don't think that really makes sense. I think Bitcoin is backed by energy or electricity. And why is that? Because it satisfies proof of work. And this is also a nice saying that we like to use to prove what you are doing in your daily life. You're proving that you're putting in the work to get a certain outcome. And that's why Bitcoin is so powerful. And if you get into the mining and energy side of things, then you'll really understand that Bitcoin is one of the most important innovations that's happened to our power grid, and having it backed by energy is probably the most ingenious idea of the 21st century. So for more education on that, I highly recommend you research into mining if you want to understand the dynamics of that. And then, of course, Bitcoin is fully decentralized. So I know we had a debate here maybe a couple weeks ago on shitcoins versus Bitcoin. Bitcoin has no CEO, it has no customer service, it has no Vitalik increasing the supply or making weird tweets and weird books to sell. But, that's a shame. But it requires responsibility. So that's the most important aspect of it. And it requires that you take personal responsibility in learning how it works and taking self-custody and being your own bank. So now I'm probably running over time here, but I'm almost done. Regenerative agriculture. This is the solution to fixing our food system. instead of a high input, high output, it's a low input, high output. And you might be wondering, well, that doesn't make any sense. How does that work? Well, it promotes biodiversity by emulating nature and emulating natural systems. So it really comes back down to the soil health, and increasing the soil health by promoting biodiversity above the ground increases the biodiversity below the ground, which is really where all the life is going on. You know, there might be hundreds of animals and thousands of insects above the ground, but there's billions of microbes, nematodes, worms, and other things below the ground, mycorrhizal fungi and other fungal networks that are really the true biodiversity and increasing the life and health of the soil. So this leads to higher organic matter, higher crop yields over time, improved water retention, improved resilience to pests, as well as higher nutrient density in our crops. So it's pretty much a win-win-win-win-win. So what's the issue? It requires patience. It requires changing from the guaranteed crop insurance check monocrop system to a regenerative system, which might take 2 to 5 years and a lot of education and a leap of faith. But the benefits are pretty much obvious. And over time, if you lower your time preference, we can have a more sustainable and a more reliant food system. And just to give you an example of water retention differences, you know, each 1% increase in organic matter in the soil, or each 1% of organic matter in the soil leads to being able to hold 20,000 gallons of water per acre. So you're utilizing all of the rainfall on your land as opposed to the dirt that is on monocrop farms, which is pretty much just getting saturated within a few inches, barely a few gallons of water. So they're not even utilizing the environment's natural fertilizer. What are the challenges to getting to this point? How do we convince people to join our movement of regenerative agriculture and Bitcoin, or decentralized currency? Well, scalability and replicating the systems is the most important part. There's definitely some challenges there. The Lightning Network solving a lot of those on the Bitcoin front, and just imitation and learnings through regenerative agriculture, education are really the biggest keys, and you know, making connections and lowering your time preference. So education, this is what we're all about here. This is what I wrote a book about, and this is what programs like the Beef Initiative are about: spreading the word, learning, making connections, and having conviction over convenience, and lowering our time preferences. So changing your time preference from a couple days to a couple years. So what can you do to help further progress the decentralization of our society and the movement towards a better monetary system and a better food system? You can get connected. You can shake your rancher's hand. You can go to farmers markets, get connected to your food system, purchasing your food directly from the producer as opposed to grocery stores who are importing that from many other countries. Get educated on Bitcoin, get off zero, encourage the Bitcoin circular economy by paying your rancher in Bitcoin, paying anybody you buy products from in Bitcoin, so then they can circle that back around in the economy locally, and then educate and empower others to take part. I know family members can be tough, but if you tell them 1,000 times, they might listen. Except your dad. My dad will never listen. So my work, what else I'm doing, how you can follow more of me. So my book, Bitcoin and Beef, is available on Amazon and the Oshi app for Bitcoin. I have a few copies here. I'm on Twitter. I will be in Austin, Texas next week. Probably be back here in Denver for a National Bison Conference in January. And I'll be skiing a lot in the winter in Salt Lake. If you like skiing, you can hit me up. But I'm also building a direct-to-consumer bison meat brand out of Wyoming. So if you're interested in any bison that's grass-fed, grass-finished from Wyoming, please let me know. We are taking deposits now on quarters, halves, and wholes, and we'll have smaller boxes available. So that's what I'm all about. Thank you so much for joining, for listening to me rant on for probably too long. But this is my story, and I think we have a really powerful message here, and we have the education, the tools available to take back control of our society for the individual to have a better quality life. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Some water first.
I love that I have wife privilege. I think you did a great job talking about like decentralization in Bitcoin and in beef. One thing I'd love for you to talk about is the centralization of, and I'm going to butcher this word, which is ironic, of abattoirs. So slaughterhouses, for those who aren't familiar, and what consumers can do to help encourage decentralization in that specific area of beef.
Yeah, so processing is a major issue. It's probably the biggest bottleneck in the meat industry, and there have been so many legislative, rules and hoops to jump through that has been a result of the big four meat companies kind of owning the industry. So there's a lot of USDA regulations, and a lot of processing plants that are smaller have closed down as a result of not being able to compete. So it's a huge issue. Basically, what you can do is, if you know your rancher, you can get involved and ask where they process their meat. If it's local, you don't need to go to a USDA certified inspected facility. If it doesn't cross state lines, a state inspected facility is sufficient. So you can get connected there and ask how they're running their business and if there's anything you can do to support. I know the Beef Initiative is educating more about processing. There's next weekend, right, Jason, in Austin, Texas. The K&C Cattle just opened up their processing facility that's kind of more for the people, not a part of the big conglomerates. So I would say get connected and support state inspected facilities over large USDA facilities. And yeah, anything to add there?
Sure.
Phone a friend.
So you may or may not know, in the state of Colorado, we passed the Animal Shares Act 2 years ago. And so you can sell single piece part, direct to consumer, beef, lamb, pork, chickens. And so you can do a small slaughter facility. You can actually butcher in your backyard and sell individual cuts direct to consumer without any inspection at all whatsoever. So that's just good to know. Honestly, what we lack is capital. I've been working with multiple different state and regional organizations trying to build more what we call microprocessors. So that's 30 head of beeves a week or less. And right now, startup costs, including real estate's about $3.5 million to get one off the ground. And so if you look at the cash flow necessary to do that, you're going to have to butcher eight a week for 7.5 years before you're even paying principal on that investment. And so we're talking with Slow Money and Two Forks and some of those fiduciary type of organizations about trying to build some new plants. The fantastic thing is, and if you'll look at any of the new plants that have been built around, they're modular. So when they're cooling, they only have to cool the size of freezer necessary for the head that are hanging. So it saves huge energy costs. I helped a young man restart a processing facility in Paonia, Colorado. He calls himself the Barefoot Butcher. He literally butchers barefoot, right? So he comes to the ranch, we kill on farm, and he's bare feet. But that plant is 70 years old. His electricity is $1,600 a month because it's just, the technology is that old. So he literally has to hump up to be able to process enough to just cash flow the business, let alone actually make a living. So I've been trying to steer more people towards him. He's just not, people aren't used to that kind of, because he's a hardcore hippie, and he's into it, and so, but we need more of those plants. And we actually have almost 150 mothballed small plants in the state of Colorado that they just couldn't make money doing it the conventional way. And so they just walked away from them. The butcher retired and walked away from them. They still exist. It's going to take some money to put get them going again, but there's so much potential all over. So that's something, shake your rancher's hand. So that's the way you can get educated on that. So.
We'll have to do a second talk on that at some point. Next question.
So this will be a good follow-up. How does this work for vegans? Like, what choice can a vegan take? Is it just eat local, or?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So their regenerative agriculture, the beauty of it is it's plants and animals. And, vegans are often critical of the fact that animals need to be there, but the Rodale Institute and other institutes have proven that regenerative agriculture with animals is more effective at improving soil health than just plants. But you can still grow plants as a result of that because you'll have, higher crop yields. So vegans in general, vegans are interesting because there's like almost two types. I feel like you could be the whole plant-based burger type person, or a lot of them are eating a lot of whole foods. So I would say the same thing. And I'm not a strict carnivore. I eat, plants as well. I go to the farmer's market to get my produce. I eat what's in season. I don't support eating tropical fruits in Wyoming in December. Things like that. That doesn't make any sense. So I would say eat local. Eat at the farmer's market, shake your farmer's hand as well, see what they have in season when, and just try and source everything as locally as possible and see if there's more regenerative movements going on for plant producers as well, which typically there are, because if you go to the farmer's market, farmers that are smaller scale, they're growing like 12, 15, 20 crops maybe. They got the whole plethora, which is fantastic. So they might not have some fancy regenerative label, but if they're selling 20 different plants, that's how you know, and they'll tell you all about it. So that's what I would say. That would be my recommendation.
Tristan, this is Mark. Can you comment a little bit? You talked about soil being really important, and I like to say to people who are in the ranching and the farming business that they're healthcare heroes. And you talked about soil being really important. If there's one thing we took away, but I want to just get your thoughts on, to me, soil health equals human health. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mentioned briefly, in the slides that the nutrient density of the crop that is being grown in the soil is correlated directly to the nutrient or the quality of the soil. The organic matter, the biodiversity, the life, the carbon is the currency of life in the soil. So that's a benefit. I didn't even tap into talking about carbon, everybody's favorite topic, right? Because if carbon is where it's supposed to be in the soil, it's incentivizing life and nutrient exchange through, fungal networks and the microorganisms that are in the soil. So that's directly correlating with the nutritional content and quality of the plant that's growing in the soil. And if that plant is, forage or cover crop for a large ruminant, that's also going to directly correlate to the nutrient density in the meat that you're eating. So something I want to work on, and if anybody has feedback on this, I know a few producers that have sent in their meat to labs to get sampled. I would like to send in, Wyoming raised beef, Wyoming raised bison. I have an elk in my freezer that I shot in the wilderness of Wyoming. I have an antelope. I want to test everything to see the actual micronutrient difference. This can be a little challenging, but I can tell you it is directly correlated with the health of the soil.
So a question I have is just regarding the economy financial system as it continues to deteriorate and ultimately implode. The central bankers are obviously going to try to pivot and still take control through, central bank digital currencies. And I've also heard the argument around, on top of that, of Bitcoin being more traceable, trackable, so I hear, as opposed to things like Monero, Pirate Chain, etc. I've heard the case of them, forming some sort of umbrella over Bitcoin around the internet, something to that effect. Do you have any immediate concerns about that? And if so, do you have any, solutions that you have to add on to what you're currently doing right now around this?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that's often, a common misconception of Bitcoin. And I write about that in the book too, which is, there illicit use of Bitcoin is, Trump, Munchin, all these guys are like, it's only used by criminals. Yeah, the dumbest criminals in the world, because every criminal who has used Bitcoin has gotten caught, because it is very traceable. It's a public ledger. Every transaction is recorded for public verification and identification. The FBI has gotten very good at tracking Bitcoin transactions and finding private keys. So yes, that is a bad thing if potentially we go into this hyper accelerated movement towards CBDCs, towards social credit scores, towards complete, draconian society. So for me, is an immediate concern? No, but it is something that is a concern. So how do we get around that? That's where non-KYC Bitcoin really matters. So non-know your customer Bitcoin, which refers to not having your identity attached to the Bitcoin that you own. So how do you get that? You buy some ASIC miners and you mine Bitcoin yourself, or you work with a decentralized hosting company such as Distributed Hash. There is coin joins. There is local Bitcoin exchanges you can do that doesn't tie you to a specific address. There's, I think, more to come in this privacy space for Bitcoin. So I will say it's definitely something that perhaps needs to be thought about a little more, but it's tricky. So, yeah. But it's a very fair concern to have.
Definitely. Yeah, just hopefully more people disobeying and recognizing these criminals for who they are.
Okay, I have a question. So I don't think I heard you touch on it, but I've noticed in maybe the last year or so, Bitcoin Twitter, Liberty Twitter, this whole idea of thinking seems to have gotten a lot bigger, and I'm curious as to why you think that is, number one, and then two, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the World Economic Forum and sort of what seems to be their massive push against animal products and cutting nitrogen emissions all over Europe and Canada. What are your thoughts on those two concepts?
Eat the bugs. Yes. I'm very familiar with Klaus Schwab. Yeah. So the first question, yeah, I mean, I wrote this book in 2021, and, things were kind of, the writing was on the wall for some people. Like, everybody was calling for high inflation, food security. There was some rumors, but damn, I didn't expect it to be this accelerated this quick. So 100%. I mean, that's like the household topic, right? Everyone talks work. Oh, the Fed meetings today. What's the hike rate gonna be? It's like everyone has an economics degree all of a sudden. It's crazy how that works when things come to the forefront of public discussion. But yeah, I think it's great because people are realizing more about our monetary system. They're realizing that it's broken. They're realizing that inflation is an issue for years to come, and our government is not to be trusted with the data they put out. So I would say, yeah, it's even in what you might want to call a bear market of Bitcoin and crypto, this has become, a mainstay of discussion for public society, and it's fantastic. And I hope people actually spend the time to get educated on the fundamentals of why Bitcoin is superior as a form of money because of the scarcity and decentralization of it. Second question on the World Economic Forum, yeah, so eat the bugs. It's the same exact thing. It's this hyper industrialization of food. Bugs. Yeah, maybe they are high in protein, but they're also high in a lot of other things that probably isn't meant for human consumption. It's like a delicacy in some cultures, but I'm good on that. But they can grow mealworms in a warehouse in fucking Kansas. They could grow trillions of them and then sell it for $10 a pound as a protein powder. That's just making a food item more profitable, higher profit margins, and again, it's just growing the dependence on the industrial food system. It's filling a protein requirement that would otherwise should be filled naturally by animal products and animal foods, and it's just using the scapegoat, the classic argument of emissions and carbon and this ESG climate narrative, which I also talk a lot in the book, defending both beef and Bitcoin from an energy consumption and emissions perspective, which is absolutely false because, as we already discussed, a system with both plants and animals sequesters carbon more effectively and is the natural way that animals live and would roam on soil and ecosystems.
Real quick, I'm hoping you can confirm, but I suspect the bugs are just going to be full of glyphosates just as much as the beef and the plants, right?
I don't know what they're feeding these bugs, but yeah, probably. It's not going to be anything good. And that's another benefit of some meat-based advocates argue that why eating ruminants is better than eating grains, because when ruminants eat grains, a lot of the glyphosate is not passed on to the meat directly, as opposed to you're eating, say, corn or grains directly sprayed with such a toxic chemical. Or you could just eat Jason's grass-fed, grass-finished beef. That's no chemical inputs. But yeah, the bugs, very high concern. I think there's a lot of parasitic activity in bugs that we don't know a lot about. There's concerns with chitin, the cell wall, the material that makes up the cell wall of insects, not being fully digestible for humans. I don't know. I'm just not going to eat bugs.
So you mentioned that the state is only backed by fiat. I would like to add to that they're backed by fiat and the threat of force, which is kind of their main thing that they have. But going with that, as they're working to accept Bitcoin and other crypto as tax payments, does that change things at all? Or do you think that these cryptocurrencies remain what they are even as they're accepted from the state?
To be honest, I think the government is... It's almost like they're acting like they want to be progressive in this aspect, but they know that Bitcoin is a threat because it's fully decentralized and nobody controls it. So I would say accepting it as tax payment is kind of just a friendly gesture to put your guard down. And I wouldn't really count on the government pivoting to a Bitcoin standard anytime soon. If anything, it's going to be the complete opposite, as mentioned with the CBDCs. So yeah, I would say that's probably pretty insignificant.
So I just want to make sure I understand your thesis. You said that crop rotation would boost the yield and nutrient density of foods, but the reason we don't have it is because only certain foods are subsidized, because I presume that corporations want to maximize profits, and so if they could boost yield through rotation, they would do that. And then what is the connection of nutrition and soil to beef? Because raising crops and raising cattle are two different things, right?
Yeah, so the thesis is that the industrial farming system, which is a high input, high output model, will, they started this farming system while our soils were still pretty fertile. And, having high chemical inputs is a way to increase yield in the short term. Regenerative agriculture is a more sustainable way to increase yields from the stagnating system of, the high input, high output monocrop agriculture that is plateauing. So if you have a piece of land that has very fertile soil and then you only grow corn on it with high chemical inputs for say 30, 40, 50 years, your soil is going to be in really bad shape, and eventually, maybe it's at year 10, year 20, year 30, it really depends on the condition of that soil, your yields are going to start plateauing. So in order to resurrect the health of that soil, you need to switch to a more regenerative model. But that might take a few years to transition and get the health of the soil back to a point where you see increasing yields. So hopefully that answers that question, because the thesis is that we can't have a high input, high output farming model forever. It just will destroy the health of the soil eventually to a point where we can't even grow crops on it effectively to feed our society. So we need to regenerate that soil via more natural mechanisms such as crop rotation and crop diversity. The connection to beef is that, well, right now, 70% of soybeans are fed to livestock in the U.S., mostly pork and chicken. A lot of the GMO crops are grown for animal feed, and in a regenerative model, you can have both crops and animals. So you could have cover crops or just forage or just grass or perennial pastures that the beef is eating. So that's still regenerative model, and that still affects the nutrient quality of the beef. Did that answer your question fully? Okay.
Talking about regenerative soil back here, is there any information or research on the impact of, like, say, chemtrails in the fallout of aluminum into the soil and its effect on regenerative farming?
I'm not specifically knowledgeable about aluminum effects in the soil, but I'm sure there might be some paper or some research out there if that's a widespread phenomenon. But any toxic exposure in an environment can certainly have an impact, I would say, for sure.
Yeah, Alan, your question led into mine. I don't want to sound like the Grim Reaper, but I kind of feel like it. The geoengineering and weather warfare are like a huge concern. And I'd be interested if anyone else here keeps up with that. But basically, I'm thinking about survival and how can we protect regenerative farming? How can we scale it and protect it in order, literally, to survive, have food, have water,
Yeah.
I guess that's it.
So I think
Thanks.
I'm not too familiar with all the rabbit holes on altering the weather, but I believe a lot of it is to get perhaps more rain for more crop production. But in general, regenerative systems are more resilient. So they actually need less water. They can absorb more from the storms that are coming down. So really, it's just replicating and spreading the education if we really want to protect, and then having direct connection with your producer. Is that if you want to survive, you need to have someone you can go to for food consistently and not be reliant on the grocery stores who are getting it from wherever, because you might have 2-3 days worth of food in your house when someone who's well connected with their rancher and their crop producers have months of food. So that would be my response, but maybe I should research more on the weather altering conspiracy theories and patterns, because I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes more prominent.
There's some studies that show that regenerative farms actually have more rainfall on their farms.
Yes, that's another great point too as well. The microclimate. So if you bunch together, few hundred acres or even 1,000 acres, you can start to affect the microclimate of your region, because that carbon cycle is directly correlating with the rainfall in that area. So once you bring back life to a region, you have more farms or ranches in an area doing it the right way, promoting biodiversity, sequestering carbon into the soil, and you will get more rainfall. So you can do it the old-fashioned way.
What do you say to people who, like, a common argument I hear is that regenerative agriculture can't feed the planet? Like, there's just not enough food produced to feed everybody. And Joe Rogan's even said that on a couple of his most recent podcasts. And I'm like, Joe Rogan, someone needs to get on and set him straight. Like, so, and I've been involved in discussions on social media about it as well, and, and concerns about fertilizer and all that kind of stuff. people are like, oh, there's just not enough food produced. So I'm sure you come across that often. What do you say to those people?
Yeah. I do a little thought experiment in my book that goes through all the acreage in the U.S., and it's quite astounding. And this is another reason why animals are a fantastic source of calories, because a lot of land can be grazed, but it can't be farmed, whether it's because of the geography, the topology of the earth, or it's just not fertile enough. A lot of places bring in ruminants to make the soil fertile enough just so they can grow soybeans and other crops that are more profitable than beef. So it's really hard to do some mass scale, research study that shows regenerative agriculture can feed the world, because some land may take 5 years to get to a point where you can run a stock density of, 2 to 4 calf cow pairs per, or have 2 to 4 acres per calf cow pair. Some you might need 30 acres per calf cow pair. The land could be in such bad condition, and it might take a decade, it might take 20 years, or you might only be able to graze that land once every 4 years. Every situation, every ecosystem is completely different. So that's why it's impossible to do these calculations. But if everybody started, having a more regenerative mindset, people had chickens in their, half-acre backyard in the suburbs, we could definitely feed the majority of the country. I would say, I think it's definitely scalable, but the reason why Joe Rogan and these guys can't get their head around it is because it's not vertically scalable. There's no equation to figure it out. It's all about replication, and then it's using the land for the most effective form of calories and being patient. And then, hey, we have 93 million acres for corn, 88 million acres for soybeans that are mostly being fed to animals. 50% of corn is being used for ethanol in our cars. We don't need any of that shit. So that's another 200 million acres we can use for regenerative agriculture. Top that with the 800 million grazable acres we already have. It's definitely possible. It's never going to happen fully, but we can make tremendous progress. So I would say, and I've tweeted at Joe Rogan and all these clowns before, but it's if that's your mindset, it's never going to happen. But if we make 20% progress, this is fantastic.
I was going to say, what to respond to that directly, not Joe Rogan, but a lot of the arguments I see where people say you can't feed enough people, they're also the people that say, who effectively you're the carbon they want to reduce. So, want to feed the people or not? Make up your mind.
So when you were speaking about your thesis and how regenerative agriculture is a really important piece of this, it reminded me of plant exosomes. So I was curious if you kind of talk about microRNA. Essentially, that when you have animals next to plants in their local environment, those plants create genes, microRNA, that are exclusive to that exact environment that they're in. And so they essentially tell the animal what the environment is and how to adapt to it. So I'm curious if you covered that in your book at all, because I think it's important for us as humans consuming plants and animals that are in the same environment too.
I definitely don't go into that detail. Probably should research more and more about that myself. That sounds very interesting. But I subscribe to a thesis of logic in all aspects. There's a lot of study bros out there who won't believe anything unless it's in a study. But if you think about it, and this is why I don't really eat any products of food shipped halfway across the world, because there's a difference eating an apple that was raised in Colorado down the street than one that was shipped from Mexico in December, because there's some science and relationships going on. There's so much that we don't even know about that we can't quantify. And if you're eating local, this is why honey, if you eat honey, there's pollinators that are preventing, you're getting microdose of the plants and the flowers in your local area and prevents seasonal allergies. There's so much benefit to just eating locally, whether it's, I have friends that are health influencers that call themselves light gurus, whether it's the angle of the sun that codes some mRNA or something in the plant that tells the animal to eat it, and then you eat that animal. It's all, you're part of this environment in your own ecosystem, and you should eat within that ecosystem. I can't tell you what exact benefits to every degree, but I can tell you this is the way it was for thousands of years, and this is the way it should be.
2 or 3 more questions.
There is one problem with so much diversity. I have heard that we can batch meat almost without any checking. I have mixed feeling regarding that, because USDA and FDA, they allow consumers to make sure that this food is not very contaminated and very poisonous. So my question, do we have any free market solution like insurance or certification companies which would provide some kind of insurance if the food is not so bad?
Yeah, I don't think I'm familiar with that. There might be some third-party testing for sure that could be done, but that really just pays even more so to why you should go and see where your food comes from. Because if you trust the quality of the operation that is on the ranch or the farm where your meat or your dairy or your produce is raised, then you are verifying that that's quality. And there's always a risk for contamination. It could be it's usually at the processor, actually. I mean, E. coli breakouts are not uncommon. I talked to folks in Wyoming, and one of the main processors in the area had one earlier this year. So if anything, it's the processor, and these things happen, but that is the reason for these USDA inspections and state inspections. But as of right now, everybody has to go through those processors anyway, unless they're home butchering. I think you can home butcher some, Jason, you said earlier, right? Some stuff. So that's up to you to personally verify, but there definitely should be, I would say, third-party tests available. I'm not personally familiar with any, no.
Do you have any advice as a consumer living in a city, having kids and family that have to feed? Isn't it a lot more expensive to get this higher quality food? Do you have any suggestions how to consistently be able to eat meat and vegetables that are higher quality?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question and one I'd love to answer. So here's the first recommendation: stop going out to eat. If you cook your own food, which most Americans probably don't even do that. They're paying $20, $25 for DoorDash to drop off Chipotle, which costs like $11 at their house, which isn't even the worst option. I mean, maybe it should be Taco Bell as the example. So really, it's investing in the quality, and then as we talked, the nutrient density of the food is higher. So if you're willing to cook more at home, buy in bulk, if you buy a quarter or a half cow from Jason, it's actually very affordable, per pound. And yeah, you're not going to eat a ribeye every night, sorry. And you probably shouldn't, because you want to get a diverse set of amino acids from more collagenous cuts, such as the roast, more nutrient-dense cuts, such as the organs. You want to eat the whole animal. So my advice would be to cook as many meals as possible. If you have a family, invest in a chest freezer. Buy meat in bulk. There's a double benefit, because food security, you won't have to worry about buying meat for maybe weeks or months at a time. I've been doing this for 3-4 years now, and it's fantastic. You have to spend less time at the grocery store dealing with people that you don't like to talk to. And you're paying more, perhaps, for nutrients that are higher. So in reality, you're getting a better deal. So it's hard to quantify, and some people do this in terms of calories. it's easier. But if you just take an average meal that's, you know, lower quality or even just more processed, you know, let's not use Taco Bell, but chicken fingers and fries, and you take all the nutrients in that compared to, you know, a grass-finished steak with, you know, some local grown sweet potatoes and some other vegetable or fruit, the nutrients per dollar in that meal will be astoundingly higher than what you paid for fast food.
That's our talk. Give it up for Tristan.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget, buy Tristan's book. If Tristan leaves without selling every single copy, I'm hacking everybody's Bitcoin wallets.